Hello, everyone. I am back with part 4 of reading the Heritage Foundation's top 7 objectives so you don't have to. Today, we're going to be talking about Objective 4, reverse the growth of regulation, spending, and inflation. Now, this was a major issue for a lot of voters, but I don't think when the average American says regulation, spending, and inflation, they're necessarily thinking of the same thing that this new administration is. And this introduction is going to start to set up why. It says here, government spending, regulations, and inflation are a tax on all Americans, especially working families who struggle to make ends meet. Prudent fiscal decisions by government can enable American families to flourish without politicians and bureaucrats controlling their lives. The Heritage Enterprise will advance a blueprint to reduce the size and scope of the federal government, ensure government spends less of our money to save us from falling off the fiscal cliff, and stop the growth of federal regulations. The power of the purse is the backbone of Congress's authority in the U.S. Constitution and ensures that, especially in a divided government, Congress can prioritize federal spending. A conservative majority in the 118th Congress must exercise its power to greater extent than ever before. The time to get our fiscal house in order before the next financial crisis is extremely short. And the reason I say it like that is I want you to pay key attention to the fact that they are saying the time between now and the next financial crisis is dwindling. And we've talked a lot about how crisis can be one of those things that individuals in power use to consolidate power, because in a crisis, people are desperate for you to act and act fast. And so I think that this might hint, in my opinion, in my personal opinion, that the crisis they intend to create in order to consolidate power is a financial one, which kind of makes sense with the tariffs and a lot of the other things we're seeing about cut this, cut that, cut half the federal government. But it goes on to finish in the last sentence here. Achieving these aggressive goals would restore financial sanity to the U.S. government and set the stage for a fiscally conservative precedent in 2025. As per usual, they go on to talk about exactly how they intend to do that. Here it says that one of the things that they will work to do is introduce and pass a fiscally responsible budget resolution act in the House of Representatives in 2023. We all know that didn't really happen. It also says they would fight the introduction of at least 50 of the 200 specific policy recommendations in the Heritage Project's budget blueprint to right-size the federal government so that freedom, opportunity, prosperity, and civil society can flourish. Basically, in the Heritage Foundation's idea, they want to shrink the federal government. That's why they're talking about axing whole departments like the Department of Education or firing half of government employees. They also want to eliminate omnibus appropriations, which is kind of a big deal. So when we talk about the government shutting down, when we talk about a federal shutdown, what we're talking about is a refusal to pass one of these omnibus bills, which sets the federal government's budget for the entire year. What they want to do, instead of allowing to pass like one major budget resolution, is to break that down into a bunch of little resolutions where, okay, today we're voting to fund this branch, or today we're voting to fund the military. Today we're voting to fund education, and break them down all into separate packages. Now, while I can see a little bit what they're going for here, separating some of the budget measures from others, because people do tend to slip a lot of funding things in there for pet projects, which they mention later. What I feel like the weakness of this is if we pass every budget resolution separately, it can really throw a lot of certain departments into crisis where, okay, well, the Department of Education or the Department of Commerce, they've been shut down for 3 months because the bill hasn't moved through Congress yet. So it could cause a lot of panic in that regard. They also say that they want to separate defense and domestic spending because they're saying that defense spending is being held hostage in order to further increase domestic spending. And I don't know if you've looked at how much we spend on defense in this country, but the military budget is astronomical. Nothing that we're doing domestically has ever limited defense spending. So that's just crazy talk. Here's in the next paragraph, they do talk about those pet project programs, and that can be problematic, but overall it doesn't make up a huge amount of the budget. And then they say down here that they want to push for House hearings on improper payments in the welfare system and hearings on the PPP plans that were issued during COVID. Now, this is another part of that kind of rings like that McCarthy era vibe to me, where, okay, you're going to bring a bunch of people into the House for hearings to say whether or not they should have gotten that funding. Well, the funding's already been given. What are you going to do to the people who did get a little extra help from the government during COVID that do receive welfare? Are we talking about making these people pay them back? There's really not a whole lot of details on what they mean here. And then lastly, they say they want to set up hearings on Biden administration appointees who directed federal dollars back to their place of employment, who funded their own businesses, which also is a little funny considering, Trump will basically sell anything he can get his name on. In the next section here, they talk about passing legislation to reduce inflation, which is kind of silly in a way because you can't just reduce inflation by passing a law saying we're going to reduce inflation. You have to do that through policy. So this little part really does absolutely nothing to say how they're actually going to do that. And of course, lastly here, we have every conservative's bread and butter, reducing regulations. And while that has always been a conservative policy to reduce regulation, for instance, when we're talking about emission standards and the environment, it's always conservatives that are usually taking the line of business of, we don't need to strengthen emissions restrictions. They're fine where they're at. We're really going to eat into these companies' bottom line. But we all know that this administration is a little different. The amount of deregulation they're talking about when we look at things like the education plan that we talked about in part 1 is like, well, do we really need college educated and certified teachers? So I'm a little worried about what they mean when they say onerous regulations. Like, what's your definition of onerous? Because I'm pretty sure it's not the same as mine. And it also says down here that they will expose certain people that they feel are engaging in arbitrary or capricious regulations and trigger court injunctions against those people, which once again, back to witch hunt. They also say here, we will encourage congressional pushback on regulations by working with the House to pass a Congressional Review Act for several onerous regulations. They don't name what those are. And finally, at the state level, of course, that they'll help the states push back against these regulations. I think the number one thing that stands out about this section to me is that there's not a lot of detail. Yes, you're talking about like repealing regulations. Yes, you're talking about not wanting one big bill, but you're not talking about exactly what that plan would entail, which I think is the scary thing because they might not know that. I will be back for part 5 to explain the rest of this. My apologies for this video being a little bit different today. My green screen effect for some reason has decided to stop working, but stay safe, everyone. Bye.